This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the 633rd episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, How to Discover What Your Character Fears. At the root of all character motivations are a handful of deeply primal drivers: love and hate, desire, and fear. Fear is a big one. As the appointed protector of our survival, fear undergirds many of our reasons and motives in life. Therefore, understanding what your character fears can offer significant insights into your story and its underlying themes. Over the last few weeks, we've been diving into some of your character's deepest motivating factors. We've looked at your character's ghost, wound, weakness, and lie. And we've also examined the thing your character wants and the thing your character needs, as well as your character's desire, moral intention, and plot goal. All of these often overlapping elements within a story correspond to either motivation or goal. Although fear often plays a role in these elements, we have yet to discuss it as thoroughly as it deserves. Within a story, your character's relationships to fear will offer many variations. Not only will each character portray differing levels of fear, different coping mechanisms, and differing levels of capability in handling fear, so too will you find variation in the many different fears to which a character may respond throughout a story. You can sort a character's fears into two piles: little fears and big fears. Little fears are incidental to the story. They may indeed not be so little, for example, a crippling fear of heights, but if they don't inform the character's arc or the plot's through line, then they exist merely to provide color and personality. Now, the caveat here, of course, is that anything in a story that is given emphasis may seem to be the plant in foreshadowing and will thus call for some sort of payoff before the story's end, in which case this little fear will be intrinsic to the main through line in some way, and therefore not so little. Now, this episode will be talking primarily about your character's big fear. This is the fear that defines your character in some way, and which will be an important element within the character arc, either as the element the character overcomes in a positive arc, or is overcome by in a negative arc. Before we get started, please note that just because your character's fear does not mean they need to be cowardly in any way. Your character's fears may be largely under control within their personalities, or possibly even categorically healthy fears. Although your character's fears may hold them back, the important fears within a story are more likely to be acting as motivating catalysts, driving the characters toward a goal. And this is an important distinction, since the former interpretation can cause passive characters, while the latter is likely to keep the characters in a more appropriately active role within the plot. If your character's core fear isn't immediately obvious to you, take a look at the lie the character believes. As you may remember from last week's post, or from my book, Creating Character Arcs, the lie the character believes is best understood as a limited perspective, preventing the character from realizing a full or healthy potential within the story. Very often, the lie will be closely related to a main fear. Throughout most of the story, the character will be reluctant to exchange the limited lie for a more expansive and therefore effective truth. One of the reasons the character clings to the lie is a belief that the lie is either an antidote to and/or a protection from the thing the character fears. For example, if the character fears intimacy, a lie that relationships are all doomed to fail would seem to protect the character from that fear. It's also possible the lie is in fact causing the character's fear. For example, a lie that a certain subset of people are dangerous could cause a character to live in fear even in situations in which the people in question are trustworthy and kind. Note that this sort of lie often shows up in phrasing that doesn't obviously point to fear. The previous lie could just as easily substitute dangerous for a word that seems more empowering to the character. For example, people are weak or people are lazy. It's also possible the specific lie might show up in a way that makes the fear seem smaller. For example, the lie might not seem broadly inclusive of an entire subset of people if it is phrased so as to project its fear onto a smaller group, or even just a single person. That guy on the corner is lazy. These sneaky permutations of the lie are where you find the gold. The more harmless a belief seems to be, the easier it is to believe it is true. And the easier it is to believe, the more insidious it can be. This is also how you can make sure the lie-truth polarity within your story achieves a depth of subtlety and nuance, rather than bashing audiences over the head with black and white oversimplifications. The events of the story will challenge the character to arc out of the lie and into the truth. What this means, of course, is that the characters will be challenged to overcome their fears. Whether or not they rise to the challenge will depend on what type of arc you are exploring in your story. If your characters started out believing the lie offered protection from their fear, they will rise into the understanding that the true antidote to and/or protection from the lie is only found in the liberated mindset of the truth. It might be the truth shows the character how to overcome their fears. For example, our initial example about the character with a fear of intimacy may show him growing into the truth that intimacy is worth the risk. Another option is to utilize the truth itself to shift the character's perspective and show them that either there wasn't anything to fear except fear itself, or that there are more accurate metrics of identifying true threats. For example, the lie that whole subsets of people are dangerous might transform into the more nuanced view that humans should be judged on an individual by individual basis, allowing the character to more accurately identify both allies and threats. Fear is a complex subject. Not only do our fears motivate us in different ways, that is, sometimes holding us back, sometimes pushing us on, and not only do we react to fear in differing ways, that is, fight, flight, and freeze, but fear can also evolve through its proximity to other people's fear. In Writing for Your Life, Dina Metzger offers many insightful exercises and prompts for digging deep into one's own psyche, but I particularly liked this one. She wrote, "Be attentive so as to isolate the specific dynamic between what you fear and what you fear fears you." We often think of fear as a simplistic emotion with a single origin point and destination. I fear you. But of course, it's not nearly so simple. Mutual fear is one of the most potent magnifiers of out-of-alignment motivations and escalated behavior. Even if we want to, perhaps accurately, assign hatred or some other loathsome quality as an opponent's motivation, we always understand on a deeper level that it is the other party's fear that is most dangerous to us. And so begins a fascinating cycle of fearing other people's fear and then fearing their fear of our fear. Metzger goes on to ponder, what distinguishes hate from other possible responses like fear, disdain, dislike? Each of us responds very differently. Some of us hate and some of us fear. Some of us feel rage and others feel nausea. What we are trying to discover is the emotional barrier we establish between the world, the qualities and experiences that comprise it, and ourselves. Although not always recognized, thanks to the unhealthy relationship most of society has with anger, this emotion is almost always a first line of defense. A little tingle of fear shows up first, letting us know a boundary has been breached. But if that boundary isn't immediately protected, anger is likely to arise and push back. And if that anger isn't expressed in a healthy way, i.e. it's expressed violently or isn't expressed or isn't effective, then it can easily escalate into darker emotions such as bitterness or hatred that begin to tell stories about why the thing we fear is bad and should be punished. Now, this isn't to excuse darker emotions. Oh, they didn't mean it. They're just afraid. Nor is it to indicate that when writing a story, fear is the emotion that should always be stressed. But if the author understands the character's deepest motivating emotions, it opens the door to more complex characterizations. A few weeks ago, we discussed the wound as the primary pain point motivating the character's belief in the lie. Often, this wound originates in the character's backstory, emerging from the event called the ghost, which haunts the character. The fear and the wound will usually be intrinsically related. Indeed, the wound may simply be this deep fear that lives within the character, which can span the gamut from effective coping mechanism to full-blown PTSD. In that episode, we also talked about the weakness, which is a character flaw emerging from the character's wounded relationship with reality. In some stories, the fear can be the weakness. If the character's primary challenge is overcoming fear itself, for example, fear of heights, fear of people, etc., then the fear will obviously function as the weakness within the story. In other stories, the fear may function more subtly in the background, only influencing the character's weakness. For example, as when a character's maladjustment to society takes the form of bravado rather than fear. A useful way of examining whether the character's weakness is the fear, or whether the weakness has formed in an attempt to evade the fear, is to examine shadow polarities. In my book, Writing Archetypal Character Arcs, I talk about 6 pairs of shadow archetypes. Each one is made up of a passive archetype and an aggressive archetype. Usually, when characters lean toward a passive archetype, this indicates their main inner opponent is their own fear. When they lean toward the aggressive archetype, this indicates they have tried to banish the fear, but have done so without truly facing it and have instead covered it up with bravado or hyper-control. Shadow archetype pairs that I discuss in the book include damsel and vixen as shadow archetypes of the maiden, coward and bully as shadow archetypes of the hero, snow queen and sorceress as shadow archetypes of the queen, puppet and tyrant as shadow archetypes of the king, hermit and wicked witch as shadow archetypes of the crone, and miser and sorcerer as shadow archetypes of the mage. All right, so in closing, if you want to simplify character arc down to its most basic element, simply ask yourself, what does my character fear, and how do they overcome that fear? Add on the understanding that fear does not equal cowardice or a reluctance to move forward, but instead is a motivating survival instinct, and you've pretty much got it. So I hope you'll stop by the site and talk to me about this. Tell me about what your character fears in your story. If you'd like to be part of the Word Player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Amazon Music, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to do something to support helping writers become authors, it always means a ton if you're able to leave just a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Also, many thanks to those who support my work on Patreon. Your patronage helps make helping writers become authors and its many resources available to writers everywhere. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can find out more at patreon.com/kmweiland. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.